Major meteorological organizations are currently tracking a deep thermal anomaly in the Pacific. Forecasts now indicate an over 80% likelihood that a new El Niño event will develop by mid-2026. This graph maps the 2026 Niño 3.4 sea surface anomalies. Data suggests potential severity hitting 2 to 3 degrees above average. Yet peak intensity remains uncertain due to the spring predictability barrier, a seasonal gap where data cannot narrow down this wide variance cone. To understand the stakes of a 3-degree temperature anomaly, we have to look at the historical precedent. In 1876, a super El Niño triggered a massive multi-year drought across global agrarian societies. The ensuing collapse of crop yields and colonial resource extraction resulted in an estimated 50 million global fatalities. The ocean temperature shift effectively dismantled the food security of roughly 3% of the world's population. An El Niño operates as a systemic risk multiplier. It attacks the specific vulnerabilities of demographic and agricultural infrastructure simultaneously. Today, Southern Africa remains exceptionally sensitive to these exact fluctuations in the El Niño Southern Oscillation. This spatial forecast map of South Africa projects the anticipated regional climate shift. You can see the broadly drier and hotter conditions dominating the subcontinent, visualized by the expanding deep brown and red zones. But checking the top-line weather forecast is insufficient. To calculate the true threat of 2026, we have to trace how this specific temperature anomaly moves through the agricultural supply chain. This flowchart diagrams the pathway from the initial ocean anomaly to socioeconomic instability. We'll track the strict sequence. Meteorological shifts trigger crop stress, creating water depletion and eventually forcing a localized economic breakdown. A meteorological drought only escalates into a socioeconomic crisis when it breaks specific links within this causal chain. Look at the top of our flowchart. The transition from the mid-2026 oceanic onset directly to localized climate anomalies. This regional atmospheric map illustrates the physical mechanism at work. The El Niño effect alters atmospheric circulation, intensifying high-pressure anticyclonic systems and physically diverting crucial low-level moisture away from the southern African landmass. This atmospheric block specifically targets the eastern summer rainfall provinces, severely weakening the cloud bands over Limpopo, Mpumalanga, the Free State, and KwaZulu-Natal. The timing of this block is the critical variable. The peak reduction in moisture occurs precisely during the December to February window. The Western Cape is shielded from the worst of this specific mechanism because it sits in a winter rainfall zone, meaning its response to the broader El Niño pattern is far more varied. For the rest of the country, the heat and dry anomalies arrive exactly when the primary agricultural regions require maximum water. Moving down the cascade, we track the shift from atmospheric weather into direct biological crop stress. South Africa relies on maize as its staple crop. Approximately 95% of the national maize yield is entirely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, leaving it highly exposed to surface-level drought. This timeline matches the anticipated December to February drought directly against the biological life cycle of the maize plant. Striking exactly during the crucial grain-filling stage, the plant experiences heat sterility. This lack of moisture triggers a total collapse in yield. In the eastern provinces, perennial, water-intensive cash crops face a different biological bottleneck. Sugarcane requires consistent, year-round moisture. Prolonged drought stunts the physical growth of the cane and forces a severe reduction in its internal sucrose content, destroying its commercial value. When these distinct biological failures occur simultaneously across both staple grains and cash crops, the national agricultural output contracts. The model now maps how these physical crop failures force a macroeconomic tipping point. Looking at this trade flow map, the immediate economic consequence is a severe reversal in supply. Failing domestic yields force South Africa to shift from being a major net exporter of maize to a net importer. This localized failure removes supply from the network, transmitting rapid price spikes across the broader Southern African development community. A parallel crisis occurs within the nation's water infrastructure. Plummeting reservoir levels force municipal cuts, eliminating the supplementary irrigation that commercial farmers rely on to survive dry spells. The combination of depleted water and dead pastures hits the livestock industry next. farmers are forced to either import highly expensive emergency feed or begin rapid destocking to mitigate losses. The final human cost occurs away from the farms. As rural labor demand drops and staple food prices spike, caloric intake falls sharply for the urban poor and rural families. Agricultural shortfalls reach past corporate profit margins. They act as a regressive tax, systematically extracting capital and basic nutrition from the demographic groups least equipped to absorb the shock. We can now view the completed risk architecture, tracing the failure chain from a Pacific thermal anomaly down to regional social instability. But this isn't inevitable. The final component is the response subgraph, deliberate policy interventions acting as circuit breakers. Securing the yield requires immediate agronomic intervention, accelerating planting schedules into moist soils, and distributing drought-tolerant maize hybrids before the December block arrives. Crucial water reservoirs must be protected through strict, data-driven management and the widespread deployment of micro-irrigation to maximize agricultural efficiency. On the macroeconomic level, governments must utilize the early seasonal forecasts to secure global grain imports and deploy emergency reserves to stabilize domestic prices before the shortage hits the market. The 1876 super drought victims had no early warning systems. Today, we possess an arsenal of global trade networks, advanced satellite modeling, and established social safety nets. The Pacific temperature anomaly sets the baseline environmental threat. Preemptive human intervention will dictate whether 2026 becomes a managed economic hurdle or a humanitarian disaster.